Lastly, I'd just like to introduce Gabrielle Lebbink. Gabrielle completed her PhD at the University of Queensland and is now a plant and invasive species ecologist working to understand how large-scale disturbances via land use change, herbivores, impact plant communities. By doing so, Gabrielle aims to inform and develop land management strategies to improve conservation values across modified and disturbed landscapes. Gabrielle is also sponsored by the Australian Flora Foundation bursary. Gabrielle will be talking on the topic of the Lawnification of Australia's eastern grassy woodlands, the past, current and likely future spread of invasive perennial grass, Botryochloa petusa. Thank you, Gabrielle.
Thanks everyone. So my name is Gabrielle and today I'm going back a little bit in time and presenting some of my PhD work which I wrapped up in about 2021. I was wrapping up my PhD during COVID time, so I didn't get to present too much at the end, so I'm excited to have a audience of planty people to present some of this work to now. This talk is not really about saving species, but more about why we have to save them in the first place. So specifically, I'll be talking about lawnification, which is a word I like to think I coined that means to transform into a lawn. And particularly, I'm talking about the lawnification of Queensland's eastern grassy woodlands by this exotic grass Indian couch, which was the focus of my PhD. But I'll also be talking more broadly about ecological change and threats to biodiversity in a region that has and continues to undergo immense change. Let's see if I can do this. Excellent. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on where we stand in the surrounding areas, so the Yagara, Jiobal, Jarawa and Waka Waka, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I still want to thank Paul and Adrian from yesterday, and Paul and Ollie and Josh today for really highlighting that care and connection to country so well in their talks. So, my PhD was focused on this exotic grass, Indian couch. It's a perennial stoloniferous species that, like all good invasive species, was introduced by us for pasture and lawn multiple times across the country until we decided it probably wasn't actually very good for any of those things and pretty well stopped introducing it. And at the time when I started my PhD in 2017, this species had really started to wreak havoc up in central and northern Queensland for both farmers because it was found to not be that productive, as well as for biodiversity. So we didn't actually know too much about the species at the time, although there was some research out there by Alex Cutt and colleagues, as you can see here. But my focus of my PhD was really to expand this research and to look at how this species was impacting biodiversity, but also mapping and modelling its spread across the country and trying to identify why it was spreading and how. So, introducing me 7 years ago, I was fresh out of my undergrad at this time, so hadn't really done much field work throughout Queensland, but was about to spend 3-ish years travelling around fairly remote parts of Queensland, conducting flora surveys, scouring through historical records, and trying to find sites in the bush that had been surveyed 20 years prior. Next slide. My impressions of these first kind of field trips was Queensland's been lawnified, and I went on in the next few years to kind of quantify this lawnification by this exotic species. So I developed some habitat suitability models and I predicted its spread across Queensland. I also did a fairly detailed kind of historical exploration into when and how it was spreading across the country. But one other thing that I noticed in these field trips, and I think that what will be the focus of this talk really, is that Indian couch is really one of the many problems in this landscape that I was working in, as many of you already know, and as we've seen in previous talks already today. But yeah, there's many threats to this ecosystem, and it was an ecosystem that had changed immensely and was changing. So as well as kind of capturing this couch story, I really wanted to look into these other threats and quantify them, because I had, I guess, a thought that although Indian couch is a very pervasive, invasive plant, I suspected that it was really getting on the bandwagon of this immense ecological change happening in this region. So to examine this kind of lawnification in this broader context, I conducted a re-survey of sites that my supervisor, Rod Fensham, he surveyed in 1996, and I assessed invader cover and land use change and clearing at these sites. So when Rod surveyed them, there were 207 sites, and they were all spread across relatively intact grassland and grassy woodland ecosystems in this region that you can see on that map there, which was a region that we had kind of identified as being under threat from Indian couch invasion, but also was a region that had and continued to undergo immense change from mainly agricultural expansion. So at the time when Rod surveyed, all of the sites were used for either grazing or conservation. So in 2018, I went back and surveyed the floristics at a subset of these sites, so 54 sites. I assessed the floristics using the same methods that Rod used, which is the Queensland Core Veg methodology, surveying all species within a 10 by 2 metre quadrat. Importantly, I also looked at the cover of focal invasive plants, which Rod also did in '96, and recorded them in broad cover categories. The three invaders that I looked at was, of course, the Indian couch, which is in the middle photo here, as well as bufflegrass, which I'm sure many of you know, and Parthenium, which again, many of you know. I then used, to assess land use change and veg clearing and degradation within this region. So I'd say degradation here because I'm working in grasslands, so there wasn't necessarily trees that were cleared, but these systems may have been degraded and species composition changed. So yeah, I assessed these factors using the Queensland Government spatial data frames from 1997 and 2017. So these were the closest timeframes that I could get to the survey data that I did. So there is a bit of a mismatch there. And I'll just point out here that although these data frames are very good, I'm sure many of us know that there's errors within these data frames, and so I did do a series of data validation processes with these sites to assess the accuracy of the mapping, and this was mainly done with site assessments, but also looking at remotely sensed imagery. And yeah, so just to make clear there, I looked at the land use change and veg clearing for all of the sites, but just did floristics on 54 of the sites. And I used this data to ask how invader cover, veg clearing and land use change had changed across these sites in over 22 years. So working through some of the key results now, in 1997, there were 78 sites that were already categorised according to these mapping data frames as cleared or degraded. So this may have been that Rod was working in areas of regrowth that were still relatively intact, but regrowth. It also might have been that there was mapping errors, particularly this mismatch of scale. So Rod's working at a site scale, but these mapping products are at a broader scale. It also may have been that some of this land clearing or degradation happened in that time period between 96 and 97, where there was that misalignment in the mapping products and the site data. Well, annoying. In 2017, I found that there was an additional 17 sites that had been cleared and degraded according to these mapping products, and 36 sites were now being used for cropping. And actually 34 of these were already in areas that were mapped as cleared and degraded in 97. So that's indicating potentially that these systems, that even though they were maybe cleared or degraded, the land use was being intensified in these systems. So they were being transformed into crops. There was also 109 sites that remained remnant, which is good news, and 102 of those were used for livestock grazing, and 7 were in conservation reserves. So still very underrepresented, these ecosystems in conservation reserves. All of those sites were within the grasslands on clay that were in reserves. So looking across the region more broadly, which I maybe forgot to mention in my methods, but I did do an analysis on this whole region generally with the mapping products to look at how clearing, the extent that had been cleared in that region. And so I found that 50% of the region, more than 50% really, that had been cleared and degraded prior to 97. So that's that white area there that you can see in the map. But there was still considerable clearing between 97 and 2018, or 2017 it should be, which is in the red. And these were mainly on the Eucalyptus melanophloia or populnea woodlands, and then you've got your Acacia hyperphylla or your Brigalow and Gidgee woodlands there. So these are your more fertile systems that are being cleared mainly for grazing and cropping. I will also mention there, I didn't include it here, but I did do an assessment on how the EPBC Act, or the clearing before and after the EPBC Act was implemented for some of the threatened ecological communities in that region, and similarly found that even post this act there was still clearing happening in these threatened ecosystems, which is a bit of sad news. In terms of the invasion in these systems, so we can see very clearly there from Indian Couch that we saw a very significant increase in the presence and the cover of this species. So in 96, Rod only recorded it on one of his sites. And bufflegrass also, we can see a significant increase in this species in both presence and cover. Parthenium was a little bit different. It increased slightly, but it was not significant. So Indian Couch, that these results really just highlight how this species marched across this landscape within this time period, and kind of echo my other findings in that paper that I showed earlier. For bufflegrass, I suppose it's not that surprising for many of you that know bufflegrass, but it continues to be sown across the country as a prized pasture species, so not too much of a surprise there. These images show Indian Couch on the left at a site that's heavily infested with Indian Couch, and then bufflegrass on the right there. And then for Parthenium, this species is the only one actually that is under national legislation, so it's a weed of national significance, and I'm sure we've seen signs for controlling Parthenium along the roadsides. So this kind of limited change here is possibly a reflection of that these systems are working. It also might be that this species is an annual species that responds quite drastically to short-term changes and disturbance in the ecosystem, so it might have just been that we were not there at a time where it was having a peak period. So overall, these results really helped to quantify, I guess, what I was seeing on that first field trip, and showed a region that had undergone and was continuing to undergo immense change and loss of remnant vegetation. What we also highlight, or the site scale findings really support these findings, but also highlight these compounding threats from invasive plants. So even in areas that are remaining, there's been a significant increase in these invaders that we know are having a significant impact on native plant communities. So I suspect that invaders are really getting on this bandwagon of change in these communities. They're facilitated by disturbance, so it makes sense that they're spreading in a very highly disturbed environment. So these threats, as we've heard from many talks today, they're pretty common across Australia, and the consequences for biodiversity, we've seen some in many of the talks, but they're also likely still unfolding, and we haven't seen the full effects of these threats on these species. So it's all a little bit bleak, but I also wanted to highlight that there is promising resilience in these communities also. So diversity was really still persisting at these sites. So Rod recorded 332 species across all of his sites, and I found 240 species across a quarter of those sites. So there is still, I didn't assess the exotics in that quick analyses there, but there is still diversity persisting in these landscapes. And yeah, finally, it's exciting to see so much work on threatened species in this space, and yeah, there's a lot of amazing work happening that is helping to secure the future of species that are under threat. So that's all from me. I just wanted to say a few thank yous, particularly to the Australian Flora Foundation for helping me attend this event. I also wanted to thank Rod Fensham, my supervisor, and John, also Boris, who helped me with mapping analyses. My dad, pictured here, who accompanied me on most of my fieldwork and tramped through the long grass with my plant press. And my trusty car, Gertie, who's in the background. Thanks.